Well, welcome back to Inside the Pastor Study Podcast. I'm Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
And it is great to be back in the podcast studio. You know, one of the things that's nice about us recording on Mondays is we get a warm studio.
Yes, that's
you notice that?
Yeah, it's very nice.
So we have, we got these schedules built into our building, and this is on one side of the building that doesn't get used as much throughout the week, except for when we're down here podcasting and, other events throughout the week. We kind of, stewardship thing. We try to make sure the building's only heated when it's needed, right? And so sometimes, though, when we can't get that Monday podcast in, we have to be here on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. It's brisk in here. So it's comfortable. It's nice.
Because we just got our first real accumulation of snow up here.
It feels late.
It does. Although we're still pre-Christmas.
That's true. Yeah, but it's nice. It was nice to wake up to, it made it easier to get my girls out of bed this morning.
Did it now?
Yeah, to have some snow on the ground. There was some excitement.
Yeah. It was not exciting for me last night wheeling my trash cans.
Well, the excitement was quickly dashed when they realized there wasn't enough snow on the ground. They still had to go to school, but that's all right.
Yeah.
So welcome. We're glad you're here with us. Whether you're watching us on Spotify or YouTube, or you're listening to us on your podcast app, it's good to have you along. My name is Pastor Jeremy.
And I'm Pastor George.
And we are a father and son pastoral team serving a local church north of Boston in the city of Methuen, Massachusetts. And this podcast's goal is to give you insight into the things that pastors talk about when they're not in a pulpit or in a lectern, right?
Right.
The things that we still think through and have conversations about that aren't necessarily sermon material or Bible study material, but hopefully are things that there's things we've discovered from either scripture or from life that helps us think more biblically about our surroundings.
Informed opinion.
Yeah, there you go.
Not quite belief, but like informed opinion.
Lots of opinion on this podcast. If you're a regular listener, you've probably discovered that. Some of those opinions you resonate with, some of them make you uncomfortable, and we love all of that.
Yes.
So we're glad you're here with us. And if you're new because a friend of yours was really great and they shared the podcast with you, shoot them a text and said, "Hey, I just started listening. Thanks for sharing this great podcast with me. I appreciate that." We begin every podcast with our theological term of the week.
The theological term of the week. The theological term of the week is sacerdotalism.
So, sacerdotalism.
Sacerdotalism.
I don't know. I don't know this for a fact because this is a language we use as pastors. But I would say that most theological terms that we use are ones that people have probably heard at some point, but don't necessarily know the full definition of it. And I'm willing to bet that sacerdotalism is not a term that most of our listeners have interacted with before.
Yeah, some people just turned and stared at their dashboard, at their Apple iPlay in their car and said, "What's he talking about?" Yeah.
I'm not even sure I can spell that properly. I wrote it in my notes, and there's a lot of blur.
It's kind of a lot of blur. I noticed that. Yeah, sacerdotalism. Yeah, and so here you go, sacerdotalism. We're in the section of terms, if you will, that deal with ecclesiology. So we're talking about the church.
Yeah.
And how the church. I said that ecclesiology is how the church relates. Polity is how the church relates to itself and how it finds common ground. And sacerdotalism is a system of church polity, if you will, that the word we used last. It's a system that defines itself around a priest and around those things that make people sacred.
Okay, so as kind of a low church, as far as low church background, as far as our liturgy goes, there's a high church and low church, right?
Yes.
Have we talked about this yet? High church and low church in liturgy?
We've referred to it a little bit, but
so I'll clarify that so that I can finish my thought, right?
Yeah.
So, high church is traditions like Catholicism, but also in the Protestant world, like the Anglicans or the Lutherans, or the I don't know, there's others, but those high liturgy churches where you think of them as more rigid. There's a lot of robes involved and set prayers, and
the service is going to follow a very specific pattern. from week to week and from year to year.
Right. When low church would be more like, if you think about your typical non-denominational church, or, something we have, like maybe you got your pastor in jeans or
a suit.
Or a suit, right?
Yeah.
Even that, or like, whether, you might have your worship through piano and organ and choir or guitars and drum set, but it is less formalized than a high church view, where you'd have like priest, altar boys, confessional, rosaries, things like that. Like there could be, you associate more of those with the high church movement.
So specific prayers, specific actions, specific church calendar.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to celebrate certain things throughout the calendar year on a moving basis in a sacerdotal or in a high church experience.
Yeah.
Because there are high church experiences, they're not necessarily sacerdotal.
So that's what I was getting at. So so sacerdotal would be more on that Catholicism side of the high church experience.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Where like an Anglican church, would you say an Anglican church would or would not be in that category?
So this is fun, right? Because
I know of Anglicans who will use like prayer beads and stuff like that. That's like a difference. I'm not sure that they would necessarily have like a confessional booth or a priest.
So if there are actually high church and low church practices of the Episcopal and Anglican community. In fact, there are even some Anglican churches where when you enter the church, they usually have a sign that says, just a very small sign that usually says, we practice the presence of Christ, which is an Anglican way of saying our communion service is a full transubstantiation service.
Okay. So
we'll get into that a little later. But so you have high church, you have low church. Most people don't realize that the average Puritan, we talk about Puritans here in New England, that the average Puritan did not leave the Anglican church, or they didn't leave the Anglican church. They stayed within it. It's a small faction of Puritans that came to New England as separatists and as Congregationalists. The average Puritan actually was a member of an Anglican church, and his effort was to purify or make lower, really, to remove the trappings, to remove the high church aspect of the church's liturgy, the Anglican liturgy. So there are many low church Anglican churches.
Okay.
Right? And there are many low church Episcopal churches. What you will have with both the Anglican, with low church, high church, Anglican/Episcopal movements, and I'm just going to use the word Anglican here from this point on, because the word Episcopal is the word that we Americans attach to the Anglican Church, because once we declared independence in 1776,
it's hard to call it the Church of England anymore.
It's hard to be called the Church of England anymore.
Yeah.
So there's an exception to this rule, right? But generally speaking, Episcopalians and Anglicans are the same.
Right. There are some distinctions, but overall, like
there's actually a contemporary change that takes place in that church, right?
Yeah.
Because the Anglican Church, the Church of England, has pretty much taken the same very liberal perspective as the Episcopal Church. There's, the permission of gay marriage, the permission of divorce, the appointment of a homosexual priesthood, a lowering of the sense and necessity of Scripture. All of that exists, but what's happened, very interestingly enough, is that a church in Kenya, the Anglican Church of Kenya, think that one through. This is an African country. So the Anglican Church of Kenya revolted against that whole very
liberal
bent. And there are now Anglican churches springing up here in the United States, and they have the same sacerdotal effect.
And the same polity.
Same polity. They are predominantly white people who are joining these Anglican churches. But if you see a church that's an Anglican church as opposed to an Episcopal church, more than likely it's part of the Anglican Church of Kenya. Because they've taken a stand against some very liberal and bad things that are coming into the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, but back to sacerdotal.
So there's some clarification. There's some of the
just wanted
spectrum.
To clarify that.
So sacerdotal, like I think you could the initial association is you would think Catholicism here.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But basically any place where you have a priest or an elevated clergy who have the obligation of taking people to God, you have a sacerdotal polity.
So to derail this again, is would an AME church consider their pastor to function in that priesthood role? Because there is that elevation of the pastorate.
Yes. Yeah.
In a lot of American black churches.
Right. And the AME is a very good example because what you have there, again, an AME pastor is not actually called a pastor.
Right. It's a brother, right?
He's a bishop.
Or bishop, that's right. Yeah. Yep.
Yes. So in that sense, there's an elevation of that man. And this is interesting because, of course, the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is what AME stands for, is a Methodist move. Now, we talked about Methodism way back in the start of this series. We talked about how Methodists come out of the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church, depending on where they come out of that church. They have many of the same ideas. Interestingly enough, one of the things that leaves it with the Methodist movement is that whole sacerdotal concept.
Sure. Like the Wesley brothers helped make that shift,
well,
right?
actually, so the big guy there is George Whitefield.
Oh, okay. Right? Yeah.
Because Whitefield actually comes very close to being defrocked by the Anglican Church.
Can you imagine?
Because he, and this is the sacerdotal thing, right? And the high liturgy issue. Whitefield develops. We talked about this years ago, years ago, right?
Yeah, we've done this for a bit now.
We've done this, but we'll take you back there, right? Whitefield thinks that the entire way that the gospel is preached should change, because prior to that point, there's a very monotone proclamation of the gospel.
Right, the words themselves should carry the conviction and the passion. There needed to be that separation from that passion of the clergy, it was considered.
Right, and the clergy would teach. They would teach with terms that the average individual didn't understand, and the goal was the theory of the Anglican Church at the time was, well, if you don't understand us, then you need to improve your understanding. Which became, especially in England, became an issue because you need to improve your understanding, but they don't have a public education system that enables people to improve their understanding. And you're not going to see education reform until
the church does it.
Well, you're not going to see educational reform until Victoria.
Yep.
So, you've got probably 40, 50 years between George Whitefield and actual public education development. And maybe Whitefield is part of that in a sense, because what Whitefield says is we need to have a new method of expressing the gospel. And his new method, it was communicating in terms that people understood, but also it was communicating in places where people were. So Whitefield would go out on street corners and preach, which just infuriated the Anglican Church, because why would you do that? Why would you take the gospel to
You're
commoners?
you're lowering the holiness of God and the holiness of Scripture and the holiness of our faith.
And at the same time, see, here's the other thing that Whitefield's doing is he's challenging that priesthood of the Anglican Church. He's taking away the mystique, if you will, of being a priest, of being the one who's going to carry, and this is the concept of being a priest, right? You are the one who stands between God and men.
Right.
And the Anglican priest stands between God and man, and he communicates to God. Now, we Roman Catholics, same thing, right?
Right.
You're standing between God and man. And we call in one of the words that's often used for Pope, the Pope, which comes from the term of Father, Holy Father, Papa. Another word that is often used for the Pope is the word pontiff.
Right.
Right? And a pontiff is actually a Latin word for bridge.
Yeah. Which is different than the defendant.
Right.
That's what I was thinking of. Right. It's not plaintiff, it's
not
pontiff.
Plaintiff, it's pontiff. So the Pope is the pontiff. He is the bridge between all of mankind and God. And the local priest is your local confessor. He's the local person who takes you or stands between you and God.
Sure. Very Old Testament concept here, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And if you're really well versed in the Old Testament and you go to a Catholic Mass, you feel like you've stepped back into the temple. I mean, they removed chancel screens back in the 16th century, but you still have this feeling when you're there of, okay, I'm here and I'm watching this guy and he's going into God on my behalf. You almost, you're looking for, that whole concept, and it bleeds over into even, low church evangelical experience, because, you call that front area the altar, and
I think it bleeds over into how congregates relate to their pastor too.
Yes. Oh,
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think if you're coming from, I don't know if the opposite term would be to sacerdotalism, but I think,
I think on a scale, and we're going to get here, on a scale, probably the farthest direction is congregationalism.
Sure. Or like the Grace Brethren would have this too, right?
Yeah.
Where you have this perspective that we're all flat before God. Like there is,
total equality.
It comes out of the priesthood of all believers. Like you have that, that movement that comes from Calvin, that we're all priests. We all have access to the throne, equal access to the throne because of the cross.
Although Luther also talks about the priesthood of believers.
Right.
Yeah. Which is interesting because you would still classify Lutheran doctrine as high church or sacerdotal.
Yeah.
Because a Lutheran minister is often called a Lutheran priest, and there is a sense in that polity that your pastor is taking you to God.
Right. And so I think even in low churches, you'll see that where there is, and I appreciate the kindness that people give toward me and, respecting the work that I've done to train and prepare to be a pastor. But I also want to make sure that people recognize that we have like equal access to the throne of God, and that I am not unique in I'm unique in my call, but I am not unique in my standing before God. And I think maybe the sacerdotal thing would also say that like the priest or bishop would also be unique in their standing before God. They would have a different level of standing before God than the common parishioner would.
Right. We would say that as pastors, we take people to God as comrades,
right,
rather than taking people to God on their behalf
as fathers, right? Or as bridges.
We're not. It's the difference between Exodus 19 and Exodus 20, where all of Israel is standing before God in Exodus 19. And the response of Israel is to say to Moses, "This is just too scary, Moses. You go and talk for us, and whatever God says, we'll hear and we'll listen."
Right.
I think the problem with sacerdotalism is actually very much wrapped up in that whole Exodus 19:20 understanding, and that is, Israel says, "Whatever God says, we'll hear, through you." But once you have that mediator, you also have a lack of responsibility. And I think you see that in a lot of sacerdotal churches. It's kind of like, I don't have a relationship with God. I have a relationship with my priest. Now, if you're coming from a sacerdotal background and I'm offending you, I'm sorry. This is my perspective. I think that there's And you may not have that perspective in your sacerdotal experience. You may actually fully grasp your personal relationship with Christ, and your priest isn't necessarily doing more than assisting you or walking alongside of you in that. But I think that a great many people react to that sacerdotal experience kind of, all right,
well, the system
you go
is
talk
set
to God. I'm going to stand here, and what happens to me here is fine. Mm-hmm. You're the one that's going to fall for it.
Right. That's really the way the system is set up, and it takes some gumption to be able to step into that and say, no, I'm going to own this process myself. Right.
Right.
Whereas in our low church movement, like we're trying to explain to people that we all have personal ownership of our walk with God.
Right.
Right. And that, everybody needs to lean into this, and you all need to, we all have equal access to the throne because of the Holy Spirit. He is our high priest. So therefore we all have equal accountability before God too.
Sure. And we also have equal access. It's the concept of Hebrews 4 that says we come boldly before the throne of grace. Mm-hmm. It's God's invitation not to a priest, but to the entire priesthood, to all of us who are called by God and have been named to sit by and bear His name. Mm-hmm. We come boldly into His presence.
Oh man, I'm thinking Hebrews just has a lot to say about priesthood, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Hebrews 9 also has that same concept.
Yeah. So I think this term is going to be important because we're going to unlock some other things in future theological terms of the week. Do we feel like we've defined this well? Like I think so. For the average person who's listening to this podcast, they're just hearing sacerdotalism as a
priest-based
faith.
If you want a simple way of doing it, it is a
polity that is priest-based.
Or church government that is priest-based. There is somebody who has the responsibility of mediating and carrying grace to you.
Yeah, I remember when I pastored in New Jersey, which is a very Catholic. Well, the area I lived in, New Jersey, was very Catholic. People who were not associated with church or were loosely associated with churches, when I met them on a professional basis, would call me father.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, I'm a pastor. It's different, right? But
I stopped resisting that for a lot of those folks. It would grate on me, but I would stop. Yeah,
because I understand. Thanks for the respect, but this is different. Yeah, it's interesting.
What's crazy is there have been times in my life when I have gotten more respect from people who come from sacerdotal backgrounds and are outside of the church
than I do from
the people
congregants who are in your who are in your congregation. Sure, because just grown up differently. Right. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So all right. So for those of you who are great listeners to our podcast, this is kind of one of those cliffhanger theological terms, right?
Yes.
It's a good bridge term. It's a priestly term.
Yeah.
Bridging
kind
you.
Of pontificate.
It's a good bridge term into some future conversations to help clarify, I think, actually important distinctions. I'm looking forward to getting into some of these conversations that are coming in future episodes, because I think that there is a lot of confusion in some of these upcoming words,
right?
For the average congregant in a church. So looking forward to getting to that. But for now, sacerdotalism, it's a priest-based polity, right? So there you go. So that hopefully that'll help you out, and you can insert that one maybe into a conversation this week and really blow some friends' minds. That's our theological term of the week.
The theological term of the week.
So, we're chatting about what to talk about this week. There are always great topics, and we hit some just accidentally sometimes, and others that we plan on. Usually, we don't do a lot of planning, to be honest. But the conversation, because enough happens in our world where it's like, hey, that would make a good episode.
Sure. And there are a lot of episodes that have yet to be recorded because we just forget.
Yeah, that's true. I try to write them down, and sometimes they'll come back around.
Yeah.
But this weekend I did something kind of silly and crazy.
Stupid.
So I'm training for a race in January.
Big race.
Yep. It's called the Dopey Challenge. It's the most aptly named race in history.
Yes.
And I think I've talked about this before. And if you're part of if you're part of our actual congregation, then you're aware of this one. But a Dopey Challenge is a race at Disney where you run on subsequent days. You do a 5K, then a 10K, then a half marathon, and then a marathon. So it's 4 days in a row, those 4 races. And
right.
I did this back in 2020, right before the whole world shut down, and it was a cool experience. But the marathon was miserable because it was almost a 90-degree day and
outrageous,
incredibly humid, and I suffered but finished. And so I finished that race, and I thought, like, I could do this again. I should do this again someday. And then pandemic happened, all these other things, and so my phone is making weird noises.
Imagine.
Interesting. Wow, it's interesting. All right. Don't know what that came from. Anyway, so sorry, y'all.
At least we don't have people running lawnmowers.
That's true. So
snow blowers right now, but
it would be. Yeah. So so I did this race. Decided I would do it again someday, and decided this year it's back. And there's all kinds of cool anniversaries happening in Disney. So you have the Disney World's anniversary.
Right.
You have a big anniversary year for the marathon, a big anniversary year for the Dopey Challenge, and so I've been training for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this year this last weekend, I did something called I got to think about it again, the 4x4x48 challenge. It is a personal kind of running event. And I had a group of friends who are also doing this concurrently with me at, different places. But the idea is you run 4 miles every 4 hours for 48 hours.
What a leader. Actually had other people doing stupid stuff with you.
Imagine. It's funny, this is, I recognize that I have influence sometimes. I remember this, and it's one of those things you have to be careful of when you're somebody who has influence. Like, you have to use that carefully.
Right.
And so I'm in a triathlon team, and I knew that I knew that the Dopey Challenge was coming up in January, and I knew that about this time, leading into that, I needed to peak in my mileage in order, for that training to work before I rested and tapered into the race. And so when I heard about this challenge, I thought that would actually be a really good training event to do. And so I sent something out to the other people in my triathlon group, and it turned into a group of us doing that. It's hard, right? So, you're waking, I started on Thursday.
Explain what you do.
So I started at noon on Thursday, and I went for a 4-mile run. And then I came back, I recovered. And then at 4 in the afternoon, I went for another 4-mile run. And then at 8 p.m., I went for another 4-mile run. And at midnight, and then at 4 a.m., and at 8 a.m. And that kept going, that pattern, through 2 nights into Saturday morning. So I started on Thursday at noon. My last run was Saturday morning at 8 a.m. every 4 hours, and it was hard.
So 4 miles.
Yep.
Every 4 hours.
Yep. For
48.
Yeah.
Miles or 48 hours.
Both. So it ends up being 48 miles over the course of those 2 days, right? And so so it basically ran about 50 miles in 2 days, which is just it's a mind-boggling thing. And so The challenge of this is obviously the distance, but I think I was realizing after it was all done, most people who are runners who have some sort of base level of running can run 4 miles, and whatever speed you're able to do that at. I think a lot of people who are consistent runners could go out and run 4 miles. And one of the things that happens after you're done running is your body will eventually just kind of tighten up and go into recovery mode. And what makes this event so challenging is that right when you're in the middle of recovery mode and at your stiffest and most relaxed moment, that's when you have to go back out and run again. And you're also never really getting any great rest, because it was a lot like having infants again. You get that middle of the night wake up that's keeping you awake for a bit, and then you've got to try and go back to sleep after it's all over, so you can get a 2.5 hour nap and start over again. And so you never quite rested is the idea, right? And it's intimidating to think about. But one of the things I was noticing myself, and with this team that I managed to recruit into this event also, is that it became more doable over time, not less.
Interesting.
There was a point in which I was really miserable, about halfway through, a little more than halfway through. But my last handful of runs, my body just kind of knew what to do, and it wasn't particularly hard. And I was felt stronger in some of those runs than I did through the middle of them. And noticed that across the board with the other people who also did this run. And I think it's interesting. I think that there's a few things that I was just processing as I finished this event. Like,
yeah, because you had nothing else to do.
Nothing else to do, right? Like I listened to some audiobooks and watched some like stuff on streaming for the treadmill runs. But I think one of the first things, I was talking about this with the group, and if you follow me on Instagram, I talked about it a bit there. But I think we think a lot about our physical training or our lack thereof, and I think a lot of us understand like that the need to continue to do that with frequency, right? Like it's one thing to show up at the gym and lift some weights once and go back home and never lift again. And most of us know that we're not going to suddenly become like Arnold Schwarzenegger because we went into a gym one time.
Right.
Like you've got to go with frequency in order for that to work, right?
Exactly.
So physical training is of some value.
Yes.
I heard a famous guy say that once, and I actually read it. I didn't actually hear him.
Yeah, you didn't hear him. He was,
So but I think most of us recognize like there's a need to do that with frequency.
Yes.
In order for it to take and actually do something in our lives and be strong enough to continue to go. One of the things I was thinking about is I think discipline is also like a muscle that needs that sort of training.
Sure.
It's one thing to like train our physical selves, but I think there are things like grit and discipline and resilience that also need like frequent taxing, or else we become people who really struggle to handle moments of difficulty in our lives.
So this is kind of the difference between habit and discipline in some ways you're talking.
Yeah.
Because I know that we talk about, for example, we're coming up here on January 1st, new calendar year. Mm-hmm. People will make resolutions. One of the resolutions that people will make is, I'm going to read through the Bible this year.
Yeah.
And the thing about that is that we teach people and tell people, I don't know, we teach them as much as we inform them and give them an understanding of what's coming, is that the theory is that if you can do something for 21 days in a row, you can develop a habit.
Yeah.
And that's true. You can develop a habit.
I've thought about this thing too. Finish your thought.
But I think that what you're saying here is that there's a difference between habit and discipline. So, so you can develop that habit, but a habit you can break.
I think the 21. This is one of my thoughts over one of my runs. I think only. I might be wrong here, but my guess is only bad habits can be confirmed in 21 days.
Oh, interesting.
This is a theory of mine.
Okay.
So only bad habits are things that get solidified after 21 days.
Okay.
I think discipline can be broken at any moment.
Really? Interesting.
So here's the thing.
Yeah.
Like, if I decided to not do my workout today, I wouldn't feel all that bad about it. Maybe at first. But like if I did that for 2 or 3 days in a row, like I could easily sit on the couch for the rest of my life and not run. Like I can talk myself out of the running.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people, like you could be in your Bible and you could read your Bible. You can get all the way through Deuteronomy. You can get past the difficult Old Testament books into some of the story Old Testament books.
Right.
But miss a couple days and suddenly be 6 months behind in your Bible reading plan.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You could do the 21 days. You could do 40 days. And you could easily lose that discipline. And it may never become a habit. Like you may feel bad about missing the discipline, but I think bad habits can be confirmed in 21 days. But I think discipline is an exercise that needs continued effort.
Interesting. I like that idea.
Yeah. This is just, it's fresh. It's something I'm working on. But it's like I could quit working out and I would feel bad and I could watch the results on the scale. Mm-hmm. And I would eventually know that I needed to do something to fix that. That's really my story, right? Like I grew up as an athlete and then through high school with some injuries, I stopped exercising with frequency and my weight ballooned after college. And it took, it wasn't until I hit my 30s I realized I needed to do something about that. So I had that life of discipline and it was really easy to break.
Yeah.
And I think, and to move that out of just the physical realm, I think that there's another piece of that the resilience word is another thing, right? I think discipline allows us to build resilience. So you got 3 different things here, right? You got habits, you have disciplines, and you have resilience.
Yes.
And I think habits are things that you just kind of naturally do because you do them all the time. And, they're not always bad, but I think there are things that you just kind of build in mindlessly. Like I have a habit of brushing my teeth at this certain,
very good.
And I have my morning habit. There is an order of operations to my morning.
Right.
And some of those are positive and some of those are neither positive nor negative. Right. And some of them are negative. Like I have a habit of checking my phone and like doing some scrolling before I actually pull myself out of bed in the morning. Right.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's a positive habit.
Yeah.
And so those are habits, but then there are disciplines. Like I have a training plan, and I make sure that I do my workouts throughout the week, most of them.
Or even making your bed. Right?
Yeah,
that would be a discipline.
It could be right.
If you did
and I when I'm sitting down to eat my breakfast in the morning, or when I'm preparing my breakfast in the morning, I listen to or read scripture. And that's a discipline that is also a habit at this point, right? So there are these disciplines, but then I don't know that habits produce resilience.
Right. No, I don't think they do.
But I think discipline does.
Okay.
So resilience is this ability to bounce back from difficulty.
Okay.
Right? Like resilience allows us to work our way through negative things in life and come out the other side, learning from them rather than being defeated by them.
Okay. The New Testament word, overcomer.
Overcomer. Sure. Yeah. I love that. So, I think there are a lot of people in our world, believers and non-believers alike, in our culture who struggle with this idea of resilience.
Yeah.
Right? My boss was mean to me, or like life is not going my way, or my 401k just got drained because of bad rates, or something, my marriage is not going well and I might have to, I'm beginning to think about like not, continuing it, perseverance idea, right, is tied into that. Like life is just getting too hard and I can't handle it.
Right.
And I think that comes, hard, and somebody in that victim mindset where life is becoming too hard and I can't handle it will often look at other overcomers and will see those as people who are uniquely gifted or special or different.
Or offensive.
Or even offensive. Yeah. And they will look at that person with envy, or they will excuse that as they're just different, or they don't have the same experiences that I have. And I think all that's false. We all have difficult experiences.
Yes.
We all live in this world of sin. We all live in a world of brokenness, broken relationships, and broken environment, and broken, and just brokenness in general. Sin impacts all of us. But I think what makes people different is their resilience. And I think discipline leads to resilience. These are things I'm processing. What do you think about all this?
I like that. And just, making an application of that. I mean, so one of the things that we see as pastors is, I think that there are folks who make church attendance a habit.
Right.
The problem with that is it's a habit, and therefore, if something comes along that they don't like, something, maybe there's a conflict with another believer at a local church,
or even just a conflict with another event. Like I have church and I have this other thing to go to.
Yeah, soccer.
Yeah, and I'm just going to go to that instead now because
right.
It's just it's just
beautiful day. Yeah. It's great.
Go out on the boat,
go play golf.
Yeah.
Right. So you have a habit, but then what happens is, because it's only a habit, and because it hasn't become a discipline, then those things come in, those beautiful days. I'm going to go out on the boat or whatever, and all of a sudden you've now broken your pattern, you've broken your habit, and now you fall out of it.
Yeah,
but discipline on the other hand is saying, I need to be in church. There's an element of conviction involved in a discipline. Because if you're convicted of the necessity of being in church in this particular situation, you're going to follow through on that discipline. And when difficulties arise, you don't find yourself derailed.
Yeah.
It's the derailment. It's like you said, that's resiliency.
Yeah.
I think that's a key issue. It's not like it's not like you've been You've been derailed. Now you've got a couple weeks off. Now you've got to rebuild your habit.
Mm-hmm.
And church attendance, Bible reading, prayer time.
Yep.
Those shouldn't necessarily be habits. They should be disciplines.
Right.
So that and you've got a discipline over a habit when a hard thing comes.
Mm-hmm. When you get a tester, like, like this event for me this weekend was a great test of how my training has been going. Like I could come out. I am able to walk today with relative ease. Like I've got some soreness in my legs, but it's a great test to make sure that my discipline of frequent training was working.
Yeah.
And I think that like in our personal lives or in our faith, like there are moments that come into life that are testing moments where we get to see if our disciplines are working. Like if they are things that we can trust and rely on for future moments. Me testing my physical ability this last weekend gives me confidence moving into my race in a few weeks that I will be able to stand up to that task.
Right.
I have no idea how I'll perform, and there are other factors that may come into that I can't control.
Right. This will not be a 2-hour marathon.
Right. No, not even close. But I know that I will, having passed this momentary test, I can look forward to a future test with confidence.
Right. Right.
And I don't know that, with just a habit of occasional running without any kind of testing, you may get derailed in a situation like this instead. Like I could hit a race having never been tested and fail in that race. Like I could not finish or or get hurt or something like that. And I've seen that entirely like move people entirely out of this sport. Right?
Yeah.
And I think the same thing happens in our faith. If we don't have this discipline and instead we have these habits of just, I'll go because I've grown up in church and it's not something I'm consciously choosing and prioritizing. Then when testing moments come, it derails us and we're not able to stand up to that test and it pushes us entirely out of pursuing the faith.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Interestingly enough, just putting a Bible spin on it. This is not a Jesus juke. This is actually
I appreciate that. That's because I think we've talked about this a lot. Like all truth is God's truth, and I think we should be able to do this.
I think it's interesting that I don't think that God ever encourages us to develop habits. He encourages us to be disciplined, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the discipline concepts of James, for example, where James says that the trial of your faith works patience, and patience bears fruit, and it's the perseverance of our faith that develops us. We were even in Timothy. Timothy is reminded,
full of this,
to be persevering, to push and to see things through, and those aren't habit words; those are discipline words.
Right. They're conscious, frequent choices to pursue difficult things because that are based on your convictions, right? Like,
right.
Because I love Jesus, because my life has been transformed by the gospel, I'm going to choose to prioritize the things of the Lord in my life. And when I choose to do that, it will bear fruit.
So here's another thing, right? Habit is static.
Yeah.
Habit is static.
It's just what I do.
It's what you do, right? Discipline is improving.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the desire to improve more. Let me give you, here's a church case in point. We're talking about church attendance, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that has come out in a lot of the latest church studies, which we had some really great podcasts, folks, on church attendance and the spiritual makeup of the people of the United States.
Yeah.
And neither one of those podcasts worked. They're dead. They're lost to history and out in the ether somewhere and never to be found, right? But one of the interesting changes that took place in how they interviewed people, they used to interview people and ask them, are you a church attender? And if you were a church attender, to qualify, you had to attend church 4 Sundays a month. They have now lowered that. You are a regular church attender if you attend 3 Sundays out of 4.
Yeah. Oh, I thought it was 2 out of 4. Yeah. Well, it's regular, right?
Regular, right? So you attend church regularly. And what's crazy is when I was a kid, you were a regular church attender when you attended
3 days a week.
Yeah.
3 services a week. Yeah.
Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night.
And you kind of look sideways at just those SMOs, right? SMOs. Sunday morning only.
Oh, man. Yeah. Those are bad. But, so now you've got this idea of 3 Sundays out of 4 makes you a regular church attender. That sounds like habit to me.
Mm-hmm.
So here's how discipline would be attached to that. Try going back to 4 Sundays out of 4.
Mm-hmm.
And think about it this way. If more people attended church 4 Sundays out of 4, church attendance would increase.
Well, yeah, sure.
Like hugely.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we have a church of 100 people,
mm-hmm.
and once people are regular attenders 3 Sundays out of 4, you know what that means?
It means on any given Sunday you have 75 people.
75 people in church.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because 25 of them are in their fourth Sunday.
Yeah.
So you would actually increase church attendance by 25% just by showing up 4 Sundays out of 4.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't crazy. So here's the derailing thing, right? Here's the difference between habit and discipline. We fully expect people to go on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a good thing to come apart, to go on vacation. We're going on vacation.
Going in January. Yeah. Run a long way.
Exactly. Yeah. We probably should do a podcast ahead of time for that. But, you can expect a hiatus in January.
Yeah, either way. We'll surprise you. You'll find out.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, we all expect you to go on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the difference between whether you have a church habit or a church discipline. What do you do the Sunday you come back?
Mm-hmm.
We have a guy in our church who just got back from a business trip to Japan.
On a Saturday.
Saturday night at 8:00, he got back from his business trip to Japan. He was here yesterday morning setting up and doing stuff before church started. That tells me he has a church discipline, not a church habit.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we're talking about here is we want you to move from being habit-driven, being discipline-driven, which means you are resilient when change comes into the picture.
Yeah, totally. So there's a second piece of this too that I wanted a second thing I've learned or was noticing last night as I was sitting with Kim, and they're obviously related, and we'll get there in a second. But so I'm on Facebook and I'm scrolling, and after the girls are going to bed, and between like a show between them going to bed and the show we were going to queue up and watch, I'm just on there, and I'm in like 2 Facebook groups for the Dopey Challenge, and I'm in another one for like just the Run Disney group, right?
Yeah.
And I was noting to my wife, Kim, that most of the posts in the Run Disney group and these other Dopey Challenge groups are the people who are barely making the time cutoff, and they're posting like their recent runs. Like, in order to do these races, you need to maintain at least a 16-minute mile pace. So it's a really brisk walk or like a run, walk, jog pace, right?
Yeah.
And I was saying to her, like, it's interesting to me that most people who post in those groups are the people on that side of the scale and not the like 6-minute mile fast people. And, and I was saying, it was interesting. We were talking about how, like, at some level, those people are kind of posting for affirmation and encouragement, right? Like, They need that. They're newer. They might be newer, or they might be coming back in after injury, and they're just looking for affirmation. But I was telling her how, in my group that I was running with, in this challenge is we're like, we had a running thread of We had a thread on a different platform, and I was probably the slow guy in that group. In that group are, the one guy in that group is the fastest American long course triathlete in the United States.
Wow.
In his age group. And then I have another guy who's, travels all over the world to do these Ironmans. He did like 5 or 6 of them last year. Like it's just insane athletes, right? And so my time to run this for, I think my fastest like segment was in the high 30s, and my slowest segment was in the high 40s. And these guys are doing this in the mid 20-minute range, doing 4 miles, right? Wow. So just blazing fast. And a lot of people are in that pace range. I was telling Kim, I felt slow. And as I compared myself to these other athletes, I was like, man, I am much slower athlete than they are. And she looked at me, she's like, you still run like sub 10-minute miles. Like this
is crazy. Yeah.
You're not slow. Right. And I was just thinking about this comparison range, right? Like you have, a group here who is excited to just be making the time cutoff. And then I'm somewhere in the middle, this other group of people who are world-class athletes. And you can get wrapped into comparison, and it can really, another scriptural principle, it can really like rob joy from you.
Yeah.
And it can take away the sense of accomplishment from the exercise of this discipline. And you can lose the joy that comes from that because you're looking around at other people rather than what you've accomplished. But one of the beautiful things about this group is we all went through this challenge together, and today we're all sore. Whether it's the world-class guy, he was posting about how sore he was, and I'm sore, and we've all kind of like worked through that at some level. And there's just a great value in completing the discipline together, even though we were at different places.
Yeah.
And there's a lot in that idea too. Like we can get lost in the comparison of where we are in this process of discipline and resilience. And, even in our faith, we can get lost in comparison on like this person's always at church and I just feel like I'm not like, the same level as they are. That person's an elder and I'm just barely like, or, if you knew my backstory, then you would know like, I can tell that story too. Like, athletically, I used to be fat. Now I'm like less fat. Like, and we can do these things, and we can rest on who we were, or we can talk about what God is doing in our lives and the things that He is teaching us in our moment of resilience, and we can share.
Yeah,
because we at least share the same discipline.
Yes,
we can encourage one another wherever we are in this process. I don't know.
I like that. I like that. So here's another thing that comes out of it. Discipline requires some stress, which this is a topic we should talk about someday. And that is, I think we've touched on it a little bit, but the whole concept of stress.
Yeah.
We live in a culture where
we're trying to avoid that as much as possible.
And it's not good.
Yeah.
It's actually good to embrace some stress in your life.
Yeah. You need to be stress tested.
It builds your discipline, right? But what I like is that the statement that I latched onto in your statement there was, you're all sore today.
Mm-hmm.
And that's cool. What you have in common is the soreness.
Sure.
It doesn't matter if you're running a 16-minute mile or a 5-minute mile. What you share in common is A, you cross the finish line, and B, you're all hurting.
Mm-hmm.
And wouldn't it be cool if we just had a Monday morning group for post-church experience?
That'd be fun.
The Monday morning church group, which is not about, I'm okay. If you're okay on Sunday morning, maybe you weren't disciplined on, or if you were okay on Monday morning, maybe you weren't stressed or disciplined on Sunday in your spiritual walk.
Yeah, interesting thought.
Yeah. And there's, we're talking physical and we're talking mental in some
spiritual
ways,
and all those things tied in there.
Spiritual discipline, absolutely. Stress it out a little bit.
Yeah, it's good, and I think maybe that's the landing spot here, like because we could talk about spiritual disciplines all day long, and
sure.
I think there was a time in my life where I avoided spiritual disciplines because I attached those to a type of church or a church movement that was different than mine.
Almost sacerdotal.
Right? And I think about like these monks who practice these spiritual disciplines, and that's not who I am. I live in the freedom of faith. And man, I love that the gospel gives us freedom of expression of our faith. But I think a lot of us rest so firmly on that freedom of expression that we don't actually express anything.
Right.
And we don't actually create patterns of discipline that give us resilience, that allow us to persevere through hard times. And then we end up on this sandy soil. I'm just going to link all of these thoughts together from the New Testament, right? We end up on this sandy soil and we get wiped out.
Because all we have are habits.
All we have are habits. And I think, the encouragement that I have come away from with this weekend, aside from feeling more prepared for a race, is also the encouragement to continue on in these spiritual disciplines that have been foundational for my own personal walk with the Lord. And recognizing that those spiritual disciplines have allowed me to persevere through some very difficult circumstances in my life. And I think they have also allowed me to be prepared for upcoming spiritual challenges that may be before me.
Yes.
And those may not be on the calendar. And that's the nice thing about a race, is I can calendar those things.
Yeah.
And I can't necessarily calendar when I'm going to encounter spiritual difficulty in my life. But if I get tested with some frequency in my spiritual walk, and I can make sure that I am testing my spiritual disciplines with some regularity, then I can move forward in my spiritual walk with confidence, knowing that when the test arrives or when the difficulty arrives, that I can stand under it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the power of walking closely with the Lord.
Yeah. It's the power of discipline.
Yeah. So just some thoughts.
Good thoughts.
You don't need to go run 48 miles this weekend.
No.
If you're capable, it's definitely an event worth trying.
Yeah.
If you're a runner, I highly encourage doing something like this at some point. But more importantly, friends, get into your Bibles.
Yes.
Don't wait for January 1.
No.
January 1 is just a made up date on the calendar. You don't have to wait for January 1. It's like, this time of year where people gorge themselves on sweets because I'm going to start a diet in January 1st.
Right.
And now you've got an extra 10 pounds to lose because you did not have discipline in December. Start now on this stuff. Don't wait for an arbitrary date. And then start practicing some discipline and see if that doesn't prepare you better for difficult times.
Absolutely. Great.
So there's some thoughts. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you have a good week, and we'll see you back here next week, everyone. Bye. You have been listening to Inside the Pastor Study podcast with Pastors George and Jeremy Stevens. Artwork by Caitlin Gallagher, music by Sam Demetrius, and engineering help from Ashley Gallagher. To find out more about us, head to marshcorner.com.